Hello, Atonement. I am coming to you from our fireside room where we just had recently done some recording for the Taizé worship service. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about worship because I know many of you are wondering, when can we worship? What is the parameters of when we can come back and worship again? And so I just want to share with you a little bit about all of the thoughts that many pastors were all in conversation constantly with the bishop and other people. We are doing our research and trying to figure out what is going to be safe. And so people have fielded some questions, and I'm just going to take a little bit of time to answer some questions so that that hopefully will give you some information. I will say that right now I don't have an answer for when we will worship again, but hopefully I'll be able to explain to you the thought process that we as a staff are going through, as a council that we're going through, and as all the pastors in our larger community are going through. So the question to when can we have worship again in person? And the answer really is that we don't know, because we're realizing the complications of this virus. One of the things I had the privilege last week of sitting in with a very special meeting, Zoom meeting online with Dr. Osterheim from, he's an infectious disease specialist at the U of M. You may have seen him speaking in different formats. But he really talked about the nature of this virus, that a couple things that make it really hard as opposed to colds and flus and other things. And the first is that this is an aerosol virus, meaning as I'm speaking right now, if I were to light incense or if I were a very potent flower, you would want distance from that, right? And you would also see how some of that smoke would start to float through the air. And by the time I'm done with this short video to talk to you, the particles of my voice would have started to spill around the whole room. So unfortunately, that creates a problem. When I'm speaking, a good 6 feet apart is a safe distance, but the longer we would be in the room together, the more those air particles would start to move around, regardless of how far apart we were. So that presents a problem when we're worshiping and they're speaking and they're singing together, that the virus just moves along in these air particles. And we also know that masks, the really specialized masks that people on the first responders wear, that suction around the face, that have a filter in them that capture just the little particles in the air, those are safe for blocking out the virus. But we also are learning that the little masks, like the ones I bought on Etsy that my family wears when we go to the grocery store, are not super helpful for a long-term sustained gathering of protecting each other from a virus. So that does make it tricky. And the question is always, if we gather together, we need to be responsible for the most vulnerable people who are going to show up at worship. So how do we honor the people who want to worship and make sure that they are protected? So the second question is, what about outdoor worship or parking lot worship? Now, these are theoretically possible. Again, we would want to maintain that whether we're outside or whether we're in the parking lot out here, that there is 6 feet of distance at all times. From the minute we pull into the parking lot to the minute we leave, we want there to be a 6-foot distance that is not breached at any point. We also want to make sure that people can hear and that we're not blasting out with such loud speakers that the neighbors are bothered. So we need an FM transmitter, which right now are kind of sold out, and that's a little bit difficult, but that is a possibility. There's been other ideas that people have come up with, trying to work with the idea of the virus being contagious for 5 days before you realize that you have it. And so workplaces and others are imagining sort of a 1 week on, 1 week off scenario. So it's possible in the future that we could do some sort of alternate week in-person worship. Again, these are ideas. People are working really hard to figure out how we can get together. there was a question that people had about herd immunity, and that was a really interesting concept for me to learn, that once we get to 60 to 70% of the population that's been exposed to the virus, there's sort of a herd immunity from the masses that will protect the vulnerable. What's tricky is there's two ways to get herd immunity. The first is to get a vaccine, which we're looking at least until January before a vaccine could be developed. And then it would be several months, Dr. Osterheim says, before you could mass produce by the billions a vaccine that would be available to the general public. The other way is that the virus itself burns through the masses, the population, slowly taking some vulnerable people with them. So these are the things that we're trying to think about. Are healthy people allowed to then gather, but the vulnerable people aren't? And how is that fair? What does that look like? So those are the questions people had talked about. Does this mean that we'll have only online worship for the foreseeable future? Again, we don't know if it's possible for us to meet in groups of 10 or 20. Maybe we could have house churches where the same groups of people come together and worship in small groups. One of the benefits of that is that online worship would be available, but with people coming together, worshiping together, there'd be a sense of community. People who are homebound or didn't have access to computers would maybe have that brought into their homes, and they'd have a greater sense of community. There's a lot to think about. One of the dangers with all of this is what I would hate to see at the front of the sanctuary is to see breaches in which people were wearing masks or gloves and then breaching the 6 feet and touching the same surfaces and watching older, vulnerable people, people with vulnerable immune systems suddenly coming into danger and them not even being aware of it. So I think you can tell this is really an interesting balance of trying to find a way for us to come together for our own spiritual health and for our social health, at the same time realizing this is potentially a very dangerous virus to some, and that it is not easily contained, and that it takes a while for us to realize that we are even infected or infectious. And these are the things that we are concerned about. So I will continue to talk with you and to share information as we go, but in light of that conference that I was a part of, I just wanted to share that information. I think in my own mind, I sort of had this thought that maybe if we all just wash our hands and put on gloves and masks and sit apart from each other and worship, that we'll be fine. And once I started thinking about like that incense, or someone has perfume on that's really strong, and how sometimes that can give us an idea of how things move around in the air. And suddenly it started to make me a little bit more nervous about what it would look like to really be in a room for an hour with one another, singing and breathing and talking together. So I don't mean to discourage you. Again, we just don't know what will happen and what new ideas and creative things people will think of. We'll keep you posted, but I did want you to understand all of the things that we as pastors and staff and council are talking about. Deep thought, deep concern is going into these conversations on your behalf, so that when we do come together, we can feel as secure as possible that we are really loving and keeping each other safe in this time. So blessings to all of you. Again, I will keep you informed as I have information. If you have more questions, if you have more ideas, please send them our way, and we will talk again soon. Bye-bye.